The transport skimmer cut a silent arc across the pale sky and settled into a plume of glittering crystals, its engines sighing as if relieved to stop fighting the cold. When the ramp dropped, the air struck like a hammer. Every breath bit through fabric and fur, and every word hung as a fragile fog between lips before shattering in the wind. The cadets filed out in pairs, boots crunching, eyes watering, antennae and whiskers and crests prickling as the cold gnawed through training suits that had seemed so impressive on the temperate moon where the briefing had been held. Evan stepped down last, tugging his hood tighter, counting steps, testing the snow with each heel before trusting his weight. He took in the horizon, a flat white silence under a dim sun, broken only by wind-carved ridges and the black thread of a frozen river that wandered toward the distant hills. He did not bother searching for trees. There were none. It was a world built from water and wind, a desert that looked like abundance. Two examiners waited beyond a row of ceramic crates stamped with Academy seals. A blue-skinned man with a frost-trimmed beard and a lean insectoid woman whose compound eyes reflected the sky in 100 fractured shards. The man, Instructor Lore, lifted his chin against the wind and spoke through a mask that crystallized as he exhaled. He reminded the group that the test would last 3 standard days. The cadets would receive basic med strips, a knife, a coil of cord, and an emergency flare sealed for disqualification. No heating elements, no synthetics that reacted exothermically with air, no chemical gels, no comms once the skimmer left. The woman, Examiner Zaire, added that the planet's winter had extended beyond forecast, and the first night would be cruel. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The cold lent authority to every calm sentence. A rescue beacon would remain active at the drop site. Any cadet could walk back and withdraw. Withdrawal would be safe. Withdrawal would be recorded. Evan listened and watched. He marked the cadence of the wind and the way powder moved across the surface like smoke, revealing harder crust beneath. He measured the light with his memory and the feel on his skin, estimating the slant of the sun against the day length reported in the briefing. He let the other cadets talk, because talking was heat leaving the body, and because talk was currency during an exam like this, a way to buy fear from someone else and hold on to borrowed confidence for a few minutes. On his left, a Talaran woman named Axira flexed 4 fingers inside a furred mitten and laughed through chattering teeth, promising her partner that she would have a snow palace before sunset. On his right, a broad-shouldered Reveron man named Cool kept stamping, cursing softly as needles of ice found seams in his boots. He had brought pride from a species that thrived in thin air on naked granite, and the pride had already started to crack. The crates opened with a mechanical chirp. Each cadet stepped forward to accept a sealed pouch and sign a slate with a frozen stylus. Evan received cord, a blade that had been ground to honest utility rather than ceremony, 3 med strips, and a flare. The flare felt heavy, as if it already knew the story of those who failed to resist opening it on the second night, grateful for heat that would singe pride as it saved skin. He slid it into an inner pocket and sealed the zipper with a press of gloved fingers, then tucked the cord where he could find it blind. Lore lifted an arm toward a scatter of flags half swallowed by drifts. The exam boundary covered a radius large enough that a slow walker would not cross it by accident, but small enough that an efficient cadet could forage across a slice in a day. Marks on a tablet indicated a frozen lake somewhere east by southeast. Zaire added that the local fauna had gone to ground. There would be fish under the ice. There would be insects sleeping in bark and moss where the snow lay shallow along the hills. She paused, allowed the silence to speak, and then dismissed the class. The skimmer doors rose, engines whined. The craft lifted and dwindled into a gray pearl against the sky, leaving a pure and indifferent hush. Some cadets moved as if a gun had fired. Axira and her partner sprinted toward the nearest ridge to claim a windbreak, chattering about slab alignment and cross-bracing. Kull set a straight course toward the east, legs grinding with practiced endurance. He did not look at anyone else. A cluster of amphibious cadets from the methane belt circled like a flock, debating whether the river ice would prove treacherous and whether thicker ice might lie near the lake. Two mammalian sisters from Corey Vale argued over the best way to lash a tarp from discarded crate liners, repeating an argument that had already migrated from dormitory to shuttle. Evan watched for another count of 10. He listened for the low moan that meant the wind would shift by evening. He felt his own breath clawing at his throat and forced the rhythm slower, longer, deeper. He had learned that from an uncle who had hunted elk in a place where winter could make a man foolish and then make that foolishness permanent. He chose a direction that looked like an absence. He walked west, not east, away from the flagged mention of a lake that would draw every desperate foot by nightfall. If water was everywhere, then water would not be scarce. Heat would be scarce. Shelter would be scarce. The first hours were not for food, but for survival, and survival meant margin. He aimed for a low rise that would blunt the wind and break the monotony of the plain, because monotony could be fatal if a man lost count of steps and wandered in circles. He lifted his knees high through the powder where the crust broke and shortened his stride on the crust itself to prevent the slips that robbed strength. He counted breaths and steps together. 4 breaths, 60 steps, pause, listen, adjust. He kept his hands below his heart when he could to save heat for his core, and he resisted the primal urge to hunch and fold in upon himself. To curl was to concede, and to concede was to shiver. Shivering was not a sign that the body fought. Shivering was a sign that the plan had been lazy. By the time the wind settled into a steady crosswise hiss, the rise loomed closer. Its face wore hard sastrugi that caught any careless boot. Evan chose the leeward side and tested the snow with the blade, noting the way the top crust gave way to packed granules beneath, then to a colder, denser layer that cut like sugar glass. He smiled without parting his lips. The layers would hold shape if cut clean and placed with attention. He used the knife to score lines, the heel of his palm to feel the resistance, the side of his boot to pry without cracking the block. He did not remove any blocks yet. He wanted to know whether the rise concealed crust over air, whether drift had built above a hollow. He listened through the blade pressed to the snow. The sound told him thickness and told him danger. Where the tone dropped to a dull thud, he stepped wide. He marked a circle with the cord and a stake improvised from a snapped crate slat he had pocketed during the distribution, a habit that had cost him a sharp glance from Zare and a private nod from Lore. He did not draw attention while he worked. He was a man in a white world, making a plan that would not be visible until it saved skin. He paid the tax of the wind with patience rather than bravado. Across the plain, voices rose and fell. Axira's laughter had grown brittle. Kul had become a dark dot against the east, already far, already committed. The Corey Vale sisters had erected a triangle of tarp that snapped and boomed as if determined to shake itself free. A small pair from the methane belt had reached the river and now stood studying the ice, both keeping a careful distance from a spiderweb of cracks. The sun crawled, unable to climb high enough to grant mercy. The light was a coin dropped on a white floor and lost in glare. Evan paused to drink. He did not gulp. He melted a mouthful against his tongue, then another, closing his lips to trap the warmth. He moved his jaw to hold circulation. He pulled his glove and pressed his wrist against his cheekbone to remind the vessels to keep working. He put the glove back before the wind could claim too much from that exposed skin. He inspected the seam of his boot and traced a line of sealant along a scuff he had noticed on the ramp. He did it now because he still had feeling. A man learned to do small chores before small chores demanded trembling hands. He set his pack at the circle's edge and knelt to test the snow again. He could feel the planet in the blade. He could feel the blunt patience of ice and the quick hunger of wind. He could feel a story forming under his hands, a story he would not tell because stories cost breath. He did not look toward the skimmer's vanishing trail. He did not look toward the lake. He cut another line, listened, and let the planet answer. The assignment had sounded simple in the warm classroom. 3 days, no tech, survive. On this plane, simplicity stripped away the flourishes of species and academy. There was only a man and a world. He intended to be the one who bent. The wind shifted 10 degrees and freshened. He adjusted the circle without complaint, giving ground to geometry rather than the urge to keep what he had already marked. Pride could freeze faster than skin. He examined the slope above and imagined the drift that would build by midnight, the way the lee would deepen, the way spindrift would scour any careless seam. He catalogued resources: snow at 3 densities, ice within a dozen minutes' walk, a probable melt-free pocket if he dug carefully at the base where hardpack met the old crust, dry air, relentless wind, cold that had become not a sensation, but a landscape. Behind him, a cadet shouted. The sound lifted and carried thinly. Evan stood and turned his head without rushing his body. One of the amphibious pair had stepped onto the wrong patch of river ice. The surface had flexed and flashed white. The cadet flailed back in time, scrambling on elbows and knees while the partner reached with a pole and hauled with frantic jerks. The cadet rolled clear and lay still for a full count of 5 before standing. The partner hammered the pole into the snow in anger, then in relief. The river lay quiet again, a smooth treachery, as if nothing had happened. Evan watched until posture and motion told him that both would manage. He turned away. He had work that would keep a man alive when night made every mistake expensive. He set the knife down and pressed his palm to the snow. He breathed in, long and slow, and the frozen air burned like a lesson taught with love and no pity. He exhaled and saw the fog of his own life hanging briefly above his hand, a small private signal in the endless white. The assignment had begun the moment the ramp touched snow. Now it felt real, and it felt solvable. He closed his fingers into a fist and opened them again to keep blood moving. He bent to cut the first true block, not to build yet, but to learn the weight he would carry and the pace he would keep until sunset. The first block came free with a soft sigh, the kind of sound a sleeping creature makes when a blanket is lifted, and Evan felt the weight settle into his arms like a promise. He set it gently outside the marked circle and cut the second, measuring by feel rather than sight, letting the blades chatter through packed crystals tell him when to ease off. The rhythm came quickly: score, pry, cradle, place. The wind combed the surface and dusted the edges with powder that wanted to steal definition, but he learned the drift's mood and worked just ahead of it, always cutting where the sastrugi offered a natural seam. He shaped each block by shaving a bevel along the lower edge with 2 clean strokes, building a language his hands could understand without wasted thought. The circle took form as a shallow trench with a lip of squared snow, and the trench held the breeze just enough that his breath no longer stung his throat. A shout broke across the plain and then turned into laughter that sounded harder than joy. Axira and her partner had begun to raise a wall in the open, stacking slabs that shattered when the wind tugged at their unsupported corners. Axira's movements were quick and confident, but her confidence fought the material instead of courting it. She jammed a slab against another and leaned until the seam fused into a thin line of pressure frost. Her partner stamped a base into the drift and tried to force a curve with straight pieces. Evan kept his eyes on his circle and his attention on his knife. He flipped the blade in his palm and carved a shallow channel that would carry his own heat back into the dome once the first course stood. Heat would be his only extravagant friend tonight. He would ask that friend to stay. Cole strode past the rise without looking left or right, his face wrapped to the bridge of his nose, his eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. Frost began to ladder up his scarf from his breath, and the ladder grew each time he exhaled, rungs of white that would soon stiffen the fabric into a board. He did not slow. He was a man who had built a self out of forward motion, and sometimes forward motion worked until it did not. Evan pulled another block, rotated it like a wheel against his thigh to knock the loose crystals off, and nestled it against the last cut. The fit made a subdued click. The sound pleased him more than any shout. By mid-afternoon, the circle had become a waist-high ring. He set his knees in the trench and laid the first true spiral course, easing each block a fraction inward so the wall began to accept the idea of a dome. He carved the keystone pocket for a door that did not yet exist, a doorway that would face the quiet side of the wind. He worked without hurry and without pauses that lasted long enough to invite cold, to take back what effort had earned. He sipped melted snow by the mouthful and counted his breaths between sips, because water could bring a man to life or make him sluggish when every choice cost warmth. When his fingers stiffened, he pressed them under his arms and kept moving his elbows to pump blood. The cold wanted him to be clumsy. He refused. The Corey Vale sisters hauled a tarp across 2 crate poles they had planted in the snow, as if the plain were soil and the poles were stakes. The poles listed. The tarp boomed. One sister yelled instructions that vanished in the wind. The other answered with a gesture that made sense in a heated argument in a warm room. Both kept going because stopping would mean admitting the plan had turned against them. The amphibious pair had learned from the river scare and now worked beside a low bank, cutting thinner sheets that would flex without snapping. Both cadets moved slowly and kept eyes on each other's footing. The lesson had cost them time, not blood, and time was painless until sunset. Evan carved an entrance tunnel by slicing 2 blocks at an angle and sliding them away from the circle to create a slot that dove under the ring and came up inside it. He ran a gloved hand along the tunnel's ceiling and smoothed the frost so droplets would not form and drip on his sleeping place, because a drip could summon a gnat of doubt that would buzz all night. He pried a shallow vent at the dome's crown and covered it with a thin slate of ice he had cut from a wind-shaded sheet near the rise, a slate with a hair-thin gap that would trade breath for safety. He could already feel the air inside go softer. His shoulders lowered a degree without conscious permission. He let that happen, and then made himself straighten again. The day was not generous enough to indulge relief for more than a heartbeat. Axira's voice drifted again, thinner now, and when he finally glanced over, he saw that she had built a shoulder-high wall that refused to turn into a roof. She braced a slab on a diagonal and stood under it to lift, asking the wind to pretend to be a friend. The slab slid and skinned her mitten. She swore and shook her hand hard enough to fling crystals from the fur trim. She looked toward the east, where Kul had become a smudge that moved with grim steadiness. She looked toward the west and met Evan's eyes for a second. He nodded once, neither invitation nor challenge, and looked back to his work. He trimmed a block's edge until a curl of snow fell like a feather and the seam mated cleanly. He had learned long ago that advice given at the wrong moment could do more harm than good, and the planet would teach everyone soon enough. The sun lowered without descending so much as dimming, a white coin dulled by a veil. The temperature slid with it. Sound changed first. The wind's hiss sharpened into a whisper that threaded through seams and hunted edges. Evan felt the change in his teeth. He tightened his hood and rolled his shoulders to reset how fabric lay along his neck. He set the last block of the 3rd course and carved a lip for the 4th, another fractional step inward, another acceptance of the curve. He studied the circumference, found a high spot where his early cuts had been a shade too generous, and shaved it down. The dome began to persuade itself into being. He smiled again without showing teeth. A distant flare punched a dull pink wound into the sky and then bled into gray. No siren followed. No engine sound grew. The rescue beacon at the drop site would record the withdrawal, and the examiners would retrieve the cadet after sunset when flight in cold air would be less dangerous for the craft. The plane went on as if nothing had happened. Evan did not look toward the flare's ash. He did not let his mind put a face to the choice. He fitted another block and pressed the joint with the heel of his hand until it squeaked and froze. The squeak was life choosing to hold. Kul returned from the east at last, moving slower now, his scarf frozen into a plank that knocked against his chest each time he turned. He carried a bundle of sticks no longer than a forearm. He must have found a scrub of wind-burned bushes on a ridge and torn them free. He knelt and tried to strike sparks into a nest of dry crust that pretended to be tinder. His gloves made his hands clumsy, and bare fingers would make his hands useless. He struck again and again, a steady clack that began to sound like a metronome set for stubbornness. A spark took and died, took and died. He hunched closer. Frost bloomed along his eyelashes like pale moss. Evan watched the rhythm for 10 beats and then turned back to his wall. He did not judge the choice. Fire would be mercy for minutes and cruelty for hours if it asked too much air and offered too little heat in return. Shelter would lower the price of every other need. He set himself to finish the spiral before the light thinned further. Inside the ring, the air had already learned to slow down. He crawled through the tunnel, tested the floor with a palm and the back of his hand, then stamped a shallow basin into the center where a small heat source could live without licking the roof. He cut a shelf into the wall for gear to dry, high enough to catch warmth without courting melt. He laid a flat sheet of ice over a narrow trench along the floor to make a channel where melt could run toward the tunnel mouth instead of creeping toward his sleeping place. The geometry of comfort under snow was small and precise, and once learned, felt like discovering a secret that had been waiting for a man to pay attention. He crawled back out and set the 5th course. The wind pushed at his back with steady hands and then, without warning, gave him a shove. He braced his knee against the trench wall and held the block until the gust passed. He whispered a word that served him in place of a curse, a word that acknowledged the shove without giving it power. He set the block and smoothed the seam. He worked by feel now more than sight, because the light had become the color of cold breath and offered little help. The top of the dome would need a capstone he could not cut too heavy or too light, a disc set into a star of seams that would share the load. He shaped that disc with care and set it aside, then lifted the last ring into place one by one until the opening waited like a held note. Axira arrived at the rise without her partner. Her cheeks burned red along the edges of her mask, and the fur along her collar had turned to white glass. She stood a moment to watch him lift the cap and settle it with a twist that married weight to structure. She said nothing. Her shoulders quivered once and then stilled. She looked at the door tunnel and at the vent slate that bled a faint plume. She seemed to measure the size against her own reach, her own supplies, her own dwindling daylight. She did not ask for help. He did not offer words that would wound her pride. He gestured toward the lee side of the rise and tapped his glove against the sastrugi in a pattern that pointed out seams and layers. She nodded once, the smallest movement, and walked to the place he had indicated. She pressed her blade into the snow and paused, listening as if the planet might answer her if she were patient. She began to cut. Cole had managed to coax a weak fire that licked at the bundle and then settled into a sulk. He crouched over it as if sheltering a child, and the child rewarded him by eating his remaining dry twigs with greed and giving back a thin ribbon of warmth. He fed it with scrapings from a crate liner and a twist of fiber from his scarf, then slapped the scarf, surprised by the pain of his own choice. The ribbon faded. He stared at the ember until the ember went dark. He lifted his head and looked toward the ring, now capped and smooth, and for a second he seemed about to stand and walk toward it. Pride tugged him the other way. He stayed. He blew again. The ember feigned life and then died obediently. Evan slid into the tunnel and sealed the door with a thinner block he had kept aside for that purpose. The dome swallowed the wind and returned his breath to him. He stood a candle of ice upright in the floor basin and lit a wick made from teased threads dipped in fish oil he had scavenged from a tin he had found wedged under a crate at the drop site, a tin someone had dropped while rushing to claim a better spot. The flame would be small and stingy, but small and stingy were safe virtues under snow. The roof did not weep. The vent plume thinned and steadied. He took off one glove to test the air and then put the glove back on before the cold could remember his skin. He unrolled his sleeping wrap and set it along the wall on the side opposite the tunnel, then sat and stretched his legs until the blood flowed fire along his shins. Outside, the plane shifted into that peculiar twilight that comes not from the sun's departure, but from the cold's ascendancy. Sound left. Thought sharpened. Mistakes blinked neon inside a man's skull. Evan pulled his pack closer and checked each item's place with eyes and fingers, counting because counting made order, and order made calm. He ate a strip of dried meat with slow bites that became heat in the gut rather than ice against the teeth, and he drank another mouthful of melt that he had warmed by holding it inside his cheek. He closed his eyes and mapped the rise, the nearest ice sheet, the path to the lake he had not yet visited, the locations of the other cadets by memory of their voices and movements. He opened his eyes and listened. The dome answered in soft ticks as seams set. The world outside rasped and moved. His breath made a gentle cloud and then vanished into the vent without argument. He lay back, not to sleep yet, but to feel what he had made hold his weight. The dome held. The night gathered its knives. He smiled in the dark and let the next set of decisions line up behind the ones already made. By the time the first thread of dawn began to show through the vent, Evan was already awake. The night had been quiet in the way only deep cold can be quiet, every sound muffled into the snow until even his own movements felt muted. He had slept in careful intervals, waking often to shift his position and check the air. Each time the dome had breathed with him, its smooth walls giving back a faint, reassuring coolness rather than the bite of frost. He took a slow breath, testing the air for sharpness, and decided it was time to move. Without rushing, he rolled his sleeping wrap, pressed the seam flat, and stowed it against the wall. He reached for the block at the tunnel mouth, broke the seal with a sharp twist, and slid it aside just far enough to push through. The moment he emerged, the wind greeted him with the sting of ice needles across his face. The sky had shifted to that pale, cold blue that promised daylight without warmth. He stood a moment at the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness reflected off the endless snow. The plane had changed during the night. Drifts had moved like slow animals, swallowing old footprints and softening the jagged edges of the ice ridges. Axira was visible to the side of the rise, her back bent, her hands busy with blocks cut in the same angled pattern he had shown her before sunset. Her structure had taken shape. A low half-dome, the curve not perfect, but promising enough to hold if she finished in time. She glanced up briefly when she sensed movement, her eyes narrowing against the glare, then returned to her work without a word. Evan understood. The first night had been the real test. Now came the race to secure the next two. He turned his attention to the day's first task, food and water. The lake lay to the east, beyond a stretch of ridges and a flat sheet of wind-scoured snow that could hide thin ice pockets if he walked carelessly. He adjusted the strap of his pack, checking the weight of the knife and cord, then set off at a measured pace. Each step was placed with intent, his eyes scanning for changes in the snow's surface texture. Ripples where the wind had carved, faint hollows that hinted at trapped air beneath. Twice he stopped to shift his route around suspect patches, testing them with the heel of his boot before moving on. As he approached the lake, the terrain began to slope gently downward, the ridges breaking apart into irregular lumps of hardpack. The ice stretched ahead, gleaming in the cold light, smooth in some places, and fractured in others where wind had driven shards against the shore. He circled until he found a spot where the snow was thinner, a sign that the wind had swept it clear and left the surface harder. Kneeling, he set the knife to the ice and began chipping, steady strokes that cut a narrow rectangle. The sound changed when he hit solid water beneath, a deep, muffled tone that told him the ice here was thick enough to stand on, but not so thick it would cost an entire day to open. He widened the hole slowly, careful not to waste energy. When the water finally showed dark in the opening, he pulled a line from his pack, thin but strong, knotted at intervals for grip. From a small pouch, he took a hook fashioned from bent wire he had scavenged during the Academy's earlier training exercises. He baited it with a strip of dried meat softened in his mouth, then lowered it into the hole. The cold leached up the line into his fingers, but he ignored it, focusing on the faint vibrations through the cord. It didn't take long. Hunger made fish bold, and the first sharp tug came within minutes. With a steady pull, he drew up a small silver-scaled fish, its body twitching weakly in the freezing air. He dispatched it quickly, then repeated the process until he had 3, enough for the day without greedily exhausting a single hole. He wrapped the fish in cloth and set them in his pack, then filled a flask with water from the hole. The water was almost painfully cold against his gloves, but he knew it would warm inside his shelter. Before leaving, he covered the hole loosely with ice shards, both to keep it from freezing over too quickly and to hide it from the wind's full force. As he turned back toward the rise, he caught sight of Kul in the distance, trudging toward the same lake. The man's gait was slower than the day before, his shoulders hunched, the scarf around his face stiff with frost. He carried no tools beyond the standard knife. Evan didn't linger to watch. The day was short, and his own tasks were far from over. Back at the rise, Axira had nearly completed her dome. She was smoothing the last few seams with her mittened hands, and though her movements lacked the practiced precision of his own, there was determination in each stroke. She paused to catch her breath, leaning briefly against the wall, then straightened when she saw him. Her eyes flicked to the fish hanging from the side of his pack, but she said nothing. He inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement, and moved past her to his own shelter. Inside, the air was still as he had left it, faintly warmer from the retained heat of the night. He set the fish on the ice shelf and took out the flask, placing it near the small oil flame so it would thaw further. Using his knife, he cleaned the fish quickly, saving the innards in a separate pouch for potential bait later. The meat he sliced thin, laying the strips over a rack fashioned from thin ice rods wedged into the dome wall. The small flame would dry them slowly, enough to make them last without spoiling in the cold. For immediate sustenance, he set aside one fish, cutting it into bite-sized pieces and chewing each slowly to draw as much warmth as possible into his body. With his basic needs met, his mind turned to reinforcement. A structure could stand one night by luck, but lasting the full test required maintenance. He stepped back outside and began packing loose snow along the base of the dome, stamping it down until it fused into a solid skirt. This would seal gaps and make the structure more resistant to wind carving at the edges. He also collected a few extra blocks and stacked them near the entrance tunnel. Emergency replacements in case the wind turned violent or the walls needed quick repair. The sun, weak as it was, had already begun its slow descent when he decided to scout the area beyond the rise. Moving carefully, he traced a path toward a cluster of small ice outcrops he had noticed earlier. Among them, he found shallow depressions where the snow had drifted thin over bare ice. He marked these in his mind, not for water, but as possible traps for small creatures if baited properly. Survival was not only about enduring the environment, but also about shaping it to serve. On his way back, he passed close enough to Axira's dome to hear the faint sound of her movements inside. She was making adjustments, her knife tapping softly against the snow. Kul was nowhere in sight. Either he was still at the lake or had taken another route. The wind had shifted slightly, carrying with it a sharper edge that hinted at worsening conditions overnight. Evan quickened his pace. By the time he returned to his shelter, the light had taken on the flat, shadowless quality that meant evening was only a breath away. He secured the entrance, checked the vent for blockages, and fed a little more oil to the flame. The dried strips of fish had begun to stiffen at the edges, and he rotated them carefully. Outside, the wind's voice grew louder, threading through the vent in a soft, steady hiss. He sat back against the wall, his hands resting on his knees, and closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to listen. The dome hummed faintly with the pressure of the storm gathering beyond, a reminder that every choice he had made since stepping off the skimmer had been to meet this moment. The second night would be harder. That was the nature of the cold. It always asked for more, and he intended to give only what he chose. By the time the wind began to howl in earnest, the light had faded to a dull metallic gray. Evan sat inside the dome, his back against the smooth curve of the wall, feeling the vibrations of the storm moving over and around him. The pressure outside came in long, rolling waves, each one making the vent plume shiver. He had eaten sparingly from the dried fish, taking slow bites and chewing until his jaw ached, more for warmth than for the food's thin calories. The storm was not the kind that struck in sudden violence. It was a steady, grinding force, the kind that could wear a man down simply by refusing to stop. The sound was relentless, like sand poured forever against glass. He pulled his hood tighter, not because the air inside was cold enough to need it, but because the weight of it around his head gave him the feeling of focus, the sense of something held close when the rest of the world was shifting. A faint noise reached him under the wind, a muffled thump, irregular, and then another. He stilled, tilting his head toward the tunnel entrance. The sound came again, this time followed by a scraping shuffle. Without hesitation, he pulled the thinner door block from the tunnel mouth and peered out. Snowflakes whipped into his face instantly, stinging his cheeks and clinging to his eyelashes. Against the white swirl, a hunched figure emerged from the storm's blur, moving unsteadily toward the rise. Axira. Her gait was uneven, her knees buckling slightly with each step, but she was carrying something under one arm, clutching it tight to her chest. He could see frost thick along the side of her mask and the rigid set of her shoulders that told him she was fighting to keep her muscles from locking up. He crawled out far enough to wave her toward the dome. She staggered to him without speaking, dropped to her knees at the tunnel mouth, and half collapsed inside. He followed her in and sealed the entrance with the block, then brushed the snow from her shoulders with quick, firm strokes. Her breath came fast and shallow, fogging her mask with each exhale. She set down the bundle she had carried, a cluster of thin, dry sticks, brittle as glass but still promising as fuel. He didn't ask where she had found them. The important fact was that she had them, and that she had made it here with enough strength to stand again. He shifted the small oil flame to one side and arranged the sticks in the basin he had carved into the floor. From a pouch at his belt, he pulled a short length of cord he had unraveled into fine threads and a scrap of oily cloth. The spark from his striker caught on the cloth at the third strike, flaring weakly before licking along the threads. The sticks caught with a faint hiss as any frost burned away, and soon the fire's thin light joined the steady glow of the oil flame. The dome's air warmed by a fraction, enough for the skin to feel the difference. Axira sat close to the wall, her hands extended toward the small flame, palms open, soaking in what warmth it gave. Her eyes met his briefly, and in them he saw both exhaustion and a stubborn refusal to be broken. When her breathing steadied, she reached into her pack and produced 2 small fish, frozen stiff. She placed them near the fire to thaw, and the faint smell of raw flesh began to drift into the air. Evan adjusted the vent slate slightly to let the smell bleed out, without letting the heat escape too quickly. He could hear the storm's voice change as the snow piled higher against the dome, the pitch lowering to a deep hum. That sound was both a warning and a reassurance. It meant the structure was holding, but it also meant the outside world was becoming harder to cross with each hour. The fire was small and had to be fed constantly to keep from dying, so he broke some of the sticks in half to stretch their life. Axira watched his hands as he worked, her gaze following the way he placed each piece deliberately so the flame would climb rather than smother. When the fish were pliable enough to handle, she cleaned them quickly and handed one to him. He held it over the fire on the tip of his knife until the skin blistered and the smell sharpened, then ate it in slow, measured bites, savoring the heat more than the taste. She did the same with hers, her eyes closing briefly after the first mouthful. The hours blurred into a rhythm of feeding the fire, adjusting the vent, and listening to the wind. From time to time, a dull vibration shuddered through the dome as if something heavy had shifted outside. Drifts collapsing, perhaps, or ice sheets grinding against each other. Once, a sharper sound came, like a crack splintering across a frozen surface. Neither of them moved to investigate. To leave the dome now would be to invite the storm to choose for them, and neither of them was ready to give it that power. Evan kept his mind on small tasks. He trimmed the edges of a few extra blocks he had stacked near the tunnel, shaping them so they could be fitted quickly if the entrance needed reinforcement. He checked the dome's inner seams with the back of his hand, feeling for any trace of cold air slipping through. Where he found one, he pressed loose snow into the gap and smoothed it until it froze in place. Axira busied herself by twisting the last of her spare cord into a tighter braid, likely planning to use it as fishing line or to secure something against the wind later. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that words would not change the reality outside. When the firewood was almost gone, Evan banked the last embers carefully, letting the oil flame take over again as the primary heat source. The sticks had done their work, raising the temperature inside just enough to keep muscles loose and minds sharp. Axira leaned back against the wall, her eyes half closed but still alert. He could see the fatigue in the slump of her shoulders, the way her hands rested loosely in her lap, but also the steady, controlled rhythm of her breathing. Outside, the storm had settled into a constant roar, the kind that could last for days if the weather decided to be cruel. He knew the next step would depend on how long it held. If it broke by morning, there would be a chance to reach the lake again, to gather more food, maybe even to check on the other cadets. If it continued, the priority would shift entirely to rationing and conserving strength. Either way, the night ahead would demand vigilance. He rested his head briefly against the dome's curve, feeling the slow pulse of the wind through the snow, and let his thoughts narrow to the single idea that had carried him this far. Stay ready. When the storm finally broke, it did not fade gently. It ended with a sudden drop in sound, as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the world. Evan awoke to the unfamiliar stillness and knew before opening his eyes that the night had passed. He pushed the block from the tunnel mouth and crawled into the open. The sky had cleared to a pale, fragile blue, the kind that comes only after the cold has stripped the air clean of all moisture. The snowdrifts had risen like frozen waves around the rise, swallowing every trace of yesterday's footprints. The horizon seemed sharper, the distant ridges cut with hard lines against the light. His breath plumed upward in thin white coils that drifted away lazily without the wind to whip them. The silence felt heavy, not peaceful. Silence after a storm meant the cold had deepened. He could feel it in the way the air bit the inside of his nose, in the stiffness of his gloves. He glanced toward Axira's shelter and saw her already outside, her body moving stiffly as she inspected the curve of her dome. She straightened when she saw him, raising one hand in a brief gesture of acknowledgement before turning back to her task. There was no need for conversation. They both knew the priorities now: check for damage, secure supplies, and decide the day's strategy before the weather changed again. He went to the lake first. The walk took longer than before, the snow deeper and softer where the storm had erased the hard crust. Each step sank halfway to his knee, and his legs soon burned from the effort. When he reached the hole he had cut earlier, he found it sealed over with a thin layer of new ice. He knelt and broke through with a few strikes of his knife, the sound sharp in the frozen stillness. The water below was darker than before, holding the faint shimmer of fish beneath the surface. He lowered his line and waited, his focus narrowing to the feel of the cord between his fingers. Within minutes, he had pulled up 2 small fish and a larger one that fought with surprising strength before yielding. He packed them in snow to keep them firm and clean, then filled his flask again before heading back. Near the rise, he spotted Kull. The man was moving slowly, his steps uneven, and the sight of him this close to the drop site told Evan what had happened. Kull had been forced to turn back before reaching shelter during the storm. His scarf hung stiff and rimed with frost, his eyes sunken in a way that spoke of a night spent with little or no protection from the cold. Evan didn't approach. Survival tests were not about kindness, and any help offered now could mean the difference between passing and failing for the one who gave it. Kull kept walking toward the drop site without looking at anyone, his head down. Evan watched until the figure grew small, then turned away. Back at the dome, he gutted the fish quickly, setting the largest aside for immediate cooking. He built a small fire in the basin, using the last of the fuel Axira had brought the night before, and skewered the fish over it. The rich smell filled the dome, making the air almost comfortable. When it was ready, he ate slowly, letting the heat of each bite push back the chill that had crept into his bones during the walk. The rest of the fish he filleted into thin strips and laid near the oil flame to dry for later. Once his strength returned, he decided to scout further than before. The storm's drifts had changed the landscape, covering some hazards but also revealing others. He moved along the ridge to the south, scanning for signs of open water or other resources. At one point, he found a narrow crack in the ice where steam rose faintly, a thermal vent. Kneeling beside it, he cupped his gloved hands over the warm air, feeling the moisture melt the frost along the edges of his mask. It was not hot enough to be dangerous, but it could serve as a place to thaw water or even warm hands in an emergency. He marked the location carefully in his mind before continuing. When he returned, Axira was waiting outside her dome with a small bundle of snow-packed fish. She had clearly gone to the lake herself after reinforcing her shelter. Without speaking, she held one out to him. He took it, nodding once in thanks, and placed it on his own drying rack inside. The exchange was brief, almost wordless, but it carried the weight of recognition. They were no longer just two cadets competing. They were two survivors acknowledging each other's place in the frozen world that had tried to break them. The rest of the day passed in deliberate preparation. He added another skirt of packed snow around the base of the dome, filled every container with water, and ensured his dried fish was properly stored. By the time the sun dipped low, the temperature had fallen again, but the sky remained clear. The night would be cold, but without the wind, it would be easier to endure. He sealed the tunnel entrance and lay in his sleeping wrap, the dried fish and water within easy reach. The dome's walls glowed faintly in the moonlight filtering through the vent, a reminder of the hours of work that now held his life inside. The morning came without drama. The sky was still pale blue, the air still biting, but the flare from the drop site rose shortly after dawn. It was the signal. The test was over. He stepped outside to see the examiner's skimmer descending in a slow arc, its shadow crossing the drifts like a moving stain. Axira emerged from her shelter at almost the same moment, her dome behind her still intact, her posture upright despite the days of strain. The two of them stood in silence as the skimmer landed and the ramp lowered. As they boarded, Evan glanced back once. The rise stood quiet, the domes half buried in snow, the tracks they had made already fading under the shifting surface. The frozen lake lay beyond, a black thread under the white, and the ridges stretched toward the horizon without end. It was a place that would forget them the moment they left, as it had forgotten every cadet before them. But for him, it would remain, a place where planning, patience, and control had outweighed brute force and luck. Inside the skimmer, the examiners moved among the cadets, taking notes, recording results. Lore paused briefly beside Evan, his expression unreadable except for the faintest flicker of approval in his eyes. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. Evan had passed not by enduring the cold, but by bending it to his will. As the craft lifted, the rise and the domes disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the frozen expanse. He felt no need to look back again. The test had been about more than survival. It had been about proving that the environment could be read like a language, that every drift, every block, every breath of air had something to teach if a man was willing to listen. And he had listened. That was why he was leaving the ice not as a man who had been spared by it, but as one who had mastered it.